Oh, come on. You really expect us to believe that bike is yours? The officer's voice dripped with mockery as he nudged the sleek carbon frame with the tip of his boot. Not enough to damage it, just enough to show control. The front wheel wobbled helplessly before the entire bike tipped over, striking the concrete with a sharp metallic crack that echoed down the quiet street. Quiet. A few people gasped. Another officer chuckled under his breath. "That thing costs more than most people's rent," he said loudly, making sure the small crowd forming nearby could hear every word. Funny how it always ends the same way. Phones were already out. Recording. Zooming in. "Step back," the first officer ordered, raising a hand inches from her shoulder, as if she might bolt at any second. "We've heard every story before." The woman didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm. Almost patient. That seemed to irritate them even more. "Let me guess," the second officer added with a smirk, slowly circling the fallen bicycle. "You just found it." A quiet ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the bystanders. The woman finally spoke, soft, steady, controlled. "I suggest you be very certain," before continuing. The officers exchanged amused glances. They had no idea who they were talking to, and within minutes, the entire tone of this street was about to change. Stay with this story until the end, because the moment the truth surfaced, nobody there would forget what they had just witnessed. Comment your city and local time below. Stories like this prove respect should never depend on assumptions. And if you believe dignity should never need permission, consider subscribing. Captain Aaliyah Brooks woke every morning at 4:45 a.m., long before the first hints of sunlight reached the quiet streets of Arlington, Virginia. Discipline had never been something she turned on only when necessary. It was the quiet rhythm beneath everything she did, the steady pulse, guiding her decisions, her movements, even her thoughts. The apartment was modest, neat, functional. Every object had a purpose. Her running shoes were aligned perfectly beside the door. Her training bag was packed the night before. Her uniform hung pressed and ready, each crease sharp enough to reflect the same standard she demanded from the recruits she trained. At 5:10 a.m., she poured black coffee into a simple mate mug. No sugar, no distractions. She stood near the window for a moment, watching the sky transition from deep blue to the faintest gray. Another day preparing young men and women for realities most civilians would never see. Another day carrying responsibility most people would never fully understand. Aaliyah had never spoken much about her work outside the base, not because she wanted secrecy, but because explaining it often invited assumptions. People imagined shouting instructors' aggressive personalities, relentless pressure without purpose. What they didn't see was the precision behind it all. Every repetition she demanded, every early morning drill, every correction of posture or breathing. It was never about control. It was about survival. Her recruits trusted her with something invisible, but invaluable confidence under pressure. When exhaustion blurred judgment, when fear threatened clarity, when chaos tried to take command, her training was what remained steady. By 5:35 a.m., she stepped outside, the cool air crisp against her skin. Her bicycle waited near the entrance, a sleek, matte black carbon fiber frame designed for endurance performance. Lightweight, efficient, built for athletes who respected precision engineering. The bike had cost $6,800, a number that often surprised people who thought they understood her. She adjusted the strap of her helmet, her fingers moving with quiet familiarity over the worn leather grip tape on the handlebars. Her father had given her that bike 3 years earlier. Sergeant Malcolm Brooks had served 22 years in the United States Army. Logistics specialist. known among his unit as a man who could solve problems before they fully appeared. He had never been a man of long speeches. When he handed her the bike, he simply said, "Strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks consistent." She rode that same route almost every morning, 7 miles, through quiet residential streets, past manicured lawns still wet with early dew, past houses that seemed untouched by the uncertainty the rest of the world often carried. The rhythm of pedaling allowed her mind to prepare for the day ahead. She mentally reviewed the schedule waiting for her at Fort Myer. Obstacle endurance drills at 0600. Tactical conditioning rotations at 0715. Evaluation assessments for a group of 32 recruits preparing for specialized assignments. Each of those recruits had already passed basic training. Now they were preparing for roles requiring more than strength. Mental control, situational awareness, composure under scrutiny. Traits she had learned through experience, not theory. As she approached Maplewood Avenue, the streets were still mostly empty. The quiet hum of the bicycle chain blended with the distant sound of a garbage truck turning somewhere blocks away. Routine created comfort. Predictability allowed focus. She leaned slightly forward, increasing speed as the road gently sloped downward. That was when she noticed the woman standing near a white SUV parked along the curb. Mid-50s. Designer athletic wear. Phone already in hand. Watching. The woman's gaze lingered longer than curiosity usually required. Aaliyah had learned to recognize that look. Evaluation disguised as casual observation. She kept riding. No reaction, no acknowledgement. Her posture remained composed. Confidence did not require performance. Behind her, the woman's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes moved from Aaliyah to the bicycle and back again. A small frown formed. Familiar calculation. Within seconds, the woman raised her phone. The screen reflected faintly in the morning light. Thumb moving quickly. Pausing. Typing again. Aaliyah did not stop. But she had encountered suspicion before, sometimes subtle, sometimes disguised as politeness, sometimes hidden beneath smiles that never reached the eyes. She had long ago decided something important. She would not live reacting to assumptions she did not create. As she reached the intersection near Willow Drive, she slowed slightly, preparing to turn toward the final stretch of road leading toward the base. The traffic light blinked yellow. Empty street. Quiet morning. Routine. Until the sudden sound of tires accelerating behind her disrupted the stillness. Then another engine. Closer. Faster. The distant flash of red and blue lights reflected briefly against the polished metal of a nearby mailbox. Aaliyah exhaled slowly. Her grip on the handlebars remained steady. Years of training had conditioned her nervous system to respond without panic. Assess. Observe. Adapt. The siren chirped once. Short. Intentional. Directed. She slowed gradually, bringing the bicycle to a controlled stop near the curb. 2 patrol cars positioned themselves at angles that made continuing forward impossible. Efficient placement. Coordinated movement. Not random. Someone had called this in with urgency. An officer stepped out of the first vehicle, adjusting his utility belt as he approached. Another exited from the second car, scanning the area briefly, before focusing his attention entirely on her. Aaliyah placed one foot on the pavement, calm, still composed, still silent, because sometimes the most powerful response was patience. The first officer stopped 2 steps away. His eyes moved immediately to the bicycle frame. Recognition. Assumption. conclusion forming too quickly. "You mind stepping off the bike completely, ma'am?" His tone was controlled, but not neutral. Aaliyah slowly dismounted. Carefully. Deliberately. Giving them no movement that could be misinterpreted. Across the street, a curtain shifted slightly in an upstairs window. Someone watching. Moments like these rarely remained private for long. The officer tilted his head slightly, studying her face, as though searching for confirmation of something already decided. Behind him, the second officer spoke quietly into a shoulder radio. Codes exchanged. Verification requested. Procedure unfolding. Aaliyah's phone vibrated once in the pocket of her athletic jacket. A reminder notification. 600 warm-up briefing. Time continued moving even when circumstances tried to interrupt it. The officer's gaze returned to the bike again. Longer this time, lingering on the brand logo printed along the carbon tubing. High-end. Recognizable. Expensive. Out of place in his mind. "You ride this route often?" he asked. The question sounded casual, but the implication was not. Aaliyah met his eyes steadily. "Yes," simple answer. No elaboration. The second officer circled slightly closer to the bicycle, examining the rear gear cassette, as though it might reveal something hidden. Aaliyah recognized the subtle shift in posture. Suspicion transitioning into narrative. A story forming in their minds before evidence had even been requested. Across the street, the white SUV remained parked. Inside, the woman who had made the call still watched. Waiting, expecting validation, expecting confirmation, expecting to be right. Aaliyah remained still. Because experience had taught her something most people only learn the hard way. Assumptions often speak the loudest. Right before the truth enters the room, at 5:41 a.m., the quiet order of Maplewood Avenue had already been disturbed long before the patrol cars arrived. From behind the tinted window of her white Lexus RX 35, Margaret Whitfield had watched the cyclist approach from nearly half a block away. The early morning light reflected softly on the polished carbon frame, highlighting the aerodynamic contours of a bicycle that to a trained eye was unmistakably expensive. Margaret did not consider herself prejudiced. She considered herself observant, cautious, protective of her neighborhood. She had lived on Maplewood Avenue for 14 years, long enough to believe she understood what belonged and what did not. The community association newsletters often emphasized vigilance. If you see something unusual, report it. Help maintain the safety of your neighborhood. Margaret believed in order. She believed in patterns, and the woman approaching on that bicycle did not match the pattern she expected to see at 5:30 in the morning on her street. The cyclist's posture was composed, athletic, confident. Too confident, Margaret thought. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the details. Professional-grade helmet, compression training jacket, carbon performance bike. That model alone cost more than most used vehicles. Her gaze moved slowly, carefully, then paused. She had never seen this woman before. Not at the Homeowners Association gatherings, not at charity luncheons, not at the Pilates studio 3 blocks away. Not walking a dog along the shaded sidewalks in the evenings, not driving into any of the surrounding garages. Margaret's fingers rested on the steering wheel as she continued observing. Something about the image unsettled her. Her thoughts began assembling a conclusion before facts had time to object. Expensive equipment, unfamiliar face, early morning timing. Her phone was already in her hand before she consciously decided to pick it up. Her thumb hovered above the screen. She hesitated briefly, then began typing. The non-emergency police number was saved in her contacts. She had used it twice before. Once for teenagers cutting through a backyard fence. Once for a suspicious van parked overnight near the corner. Both times she had been thanked, praised for her attentiveness, reinforced in her belief that vigilance was responsibility. The dispatcher answered after 2 rings. "Arlington Police non-emergency line. How can I assist you?" Margaret lowered her voice slightly instinctively, adopting a tone that conveyed seriousness. "Yes. Good morning. I'm calling because there appears to be a suspicious individual riding through our neighborhood on what looks like a very expensive bicycle." A pause. The dispatcher's voice remained neutral. "Can you describe what seems suspicious, ma'am?" Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes never leaving the cyclist who had now slowed slightly, approaching the intersection. "Well, she doesn't appear to live here. And the bicycle looks extremely high-end. It just doesn't seem consistent." Another pause. "Has a crime been committed?" Margaret inhaled quietly. "I can't say for certain, but the bike looks similar to one that was posted missing in our neighborhood online group earlier this week." That was not entirely accurate. The missing post had been vague. A blurred image, different color, different brand series. But similar enough, Margaret felt, to justify concern. The dispatcher asked a few more questions. Description. Direction of travel. Location. Margaret answered carefully, emphasizing details she believed strengthened her credibility. Yes. Mid-30s athletic build, dark athletic clothing, riding a black carbon bike, heading toward Willow Drive. She paused, then added quietly, "It just seems out of place." The dispatcher thanked her and informed her that officers in the area would take a look. Margaret ended the call, a small sense of accomplishment settling into her chest. She believed she had done the responsible thing. Across the street, Aaliyah continued pedaling, unaware of the narrative already unfolding ahead of her. Routine did not include expecting suspicion. Routine did not include anticipating being evaluated by strangers measuring worth through incomplete information. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, orderly, predictable. But perception often reshaped reality faster than truth could respond. 3 minutes later, the first patrol unit acknowledged the dispatch call. Officer Daniel Reeves, 8 years on the force, scanned the brief description displayed on the in-car computer screen. Suspicious individual. Possible stolen bicycle. He frowned slightly. Property-related calls were common in neighborhoods like Maplewood. Residents expected quick responses, visible presence, reassurance. His partner, Officer Lucas Hale, glanced briefly at the details. No confirmed theft report tied to serial number, Hale noted. Reeves shrugged lightly. Caller believes it matches something posted online. That was often enough. Perception frequently initiated procedure. Procedure rarely waited for full context. They turned onto Maplewood Avenue within 2 minutes. From half a block away, Reeves spotted the cyclist immediately. Black carbon frame, professional posture, steady pace. He accelerated slightly. Hale activated the light bar. Standard approach. Establish presence. Control environment. Prevent flight risk even when no flight risk existed. Aaliyah noticed the lights in her peripheral vision but did not immediately react. Cyclists were often passed by patrol vehicles. It meant nothing until the first short siren chirp sounded. Directed. Intentional. Reeves guided the vehicle slightly ahead, positioning the patrol car at an angle that limited forward movement. Hale mirrored the maneuver from behind. Containment pattern. Efficient. Calculated. Aaliyah slowed gradually. She had learned long ago that calm cooperation prevented unnecessary escalation. Still, something about the situation felt disproportionate. 2 patrol units, for a bicycle, for a morning ride, for simply existing in a space someone else believed required explanation. Margaret watched from her vehicle, her grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. She observed the stop from a safe distance. Validation approaching. confirmation of instinct. Proof that attentiveness mattered. Across the street, a jogger slowed curiosity, overtaking routine. A dog walker paused near the curb, phone already raised. Moments like these spread quickly. Interpretations formed instantly. Few waited for facts. Officer Reeves exited the patrol vehicle, adjusting his vest as he approached. His eyes moved from Aaliyah to the bicycle and back again. Expectation shaped interpretation. Interpretation shaped tone. Morning, he said, his voice measured, but already carrying subtle authority. We've received a report regarding this bicycle. Not a question, a statement. Aaliyah inclined her head slightly. Yes. Reeves gestured lightly toward the frame. Mind telling me where you obtained it? The wording sounded neutral, but the implication did not. Across the street, Margaret stepped out of her SUV, pretending to check something in her trunk while positioning herself closer to observe. Distance provided plausible deniability. Curiosity provided motivation. Aaliyah noticed the movement, registered the connection, understood the sequence. Call, response, stop, narrative, all forming before she had spoken more than one word. She kept her voice calm. I purchased it from Performance Cycle in Alexandria last year. Reeves nodded slowly, though his expression did not soften. Do you have proof of purchase? I can provide a receipt digitally. Hale stepped closer to the bicycle, crouching slightly to inspect the serial number etched beneath the frame. Procedure, verification. But also something else, a subtle presumption that explanation would eventually fail. Because sometimes people searched not for truth, but for confirmation of what they already believed. Margaret folded her arms lightly, watching, waiting, certain that within minutes the officers would uncover what she felt certain must be wrong. Because in her mind, certainty had already replaced curiosity. And once certainty takes hold, fairness often struggles to find its way back. Aaliyah rested her hand lightly against the handlebar, feeling the familiar texture beneath her palm. Her father's voice echoed faintly in memory. Consistency reveals character. She had never needed to prove who she was. Until now. And something told her this moment was only the beginning. Officer Daniel Reeves didn't rush. Authority rarely needed to. He adjusted the Velcro strap on his gloves, slowly, deliberately, a small gesture, but one that communicated control. The faint ripping sound of the fabric seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet morning air. Well, he said, glancing briefly at Officer Hale before looking back at Aaliyah. Let's make this simple. His tone carried a trace of amusement, as though the outcome had already been decided, and the rest was merely procedural theater. You said you bought it last year. Reeves continued, gesturing casually toward the bicycle, with two fingers, not even looking directly at her now. Mind explaining why a bike matching this exact description was reported stolen 3 days ago? The wording was careful. The implication was not. Aaliyah stood upright beside the fallen bicycle, her posture balanced, controlled, almost clinical in its stillness. I can show you the purchase confirmation, she replied calmly. Reeves smirked faintly, exchanging a quick glance with Hale. We'll get there, he said, as if indulging a predictable excuse. But first, I want to understand something. He leaned slightly closer to the frame, crouching just enough to inspect the logo again, dragging his gloved finger slowly across the smooth carbon surface. You know, he added, voice lowered just enough that it felt more personal, more pointed. These usually aren't impulse buys. A subtle pause. They tend to belong to very specific kinds of customers. Across the street, Margaret Whitfield pretended to scroll through her phone, though her eyes lifted repeatedly toward the scene unfolding. A young couple walking their dog slowed noticeably, now positioning themselves near a mailbox with an unobstructed view. Someone whispered. Someone recorded. The quiet hum of observation intensified. Aaliyah noticed every detail, not because she wanted to, because experience had trained her to. You can verify the serial number, she said evenly, gesturing toward the underside of the frame. It will match the purchase documentation. Hale crouched lower, pulling a small flashlight from his pocket despite the daylight. He tilted the bike slightly without asking, the rear wheel spinning lazily before slowing to a stop. Looks recently maintained, Hale muttered almost to himself. Reeves exhaled softly through his nose. Expensive hobbies require time, he said. Time most people working multiple jobs usually don't have. There it was. Not an accusation. Not yet. But something heavier than curiosity. Aaliyah did not respond to the insinuation. Silence, she had learned, often revealed more than defense. Reeves straightened again, resting one hand casually on his belt, thumb hooked near the metal of his handcuffs. So help me understand, he continued, his voice now carrying a tone designed for the small audience gathering behind him. You just happened to be riding a nearly $7,000 bike through a neighborhood where one fitting this description was reported missing. And you expect us not to ask questions? Aaliyah met his gaze directly. I expect questions, she said. Her voice remained calm, measured, unshaken. I do not expect conclusions before verification. The statement hung briefly in the air. Reeves's jaw shifted slightly, a small muscle tightening near his temple. Across the street, Margaret crossed her arms, shifting her weight subtly, as if settling in to watch the situation resolve the way she had anticipated. One of the bystanders murmured quietly, That bike is worth more than my first car. Another voice responded, Yeah, something doesn't add up. Assumptions layered themselves quickly when provided space to grow. Reeves extended his hand. ID, please. Aaliyah reached slowly into the inner pocket of her athletic jacket, narrating her movement calmly, as she had been trained to do in any high-tension encounter. My identification is in my left pocket. She retrieved her driver's license and handed it to him without hesitation. Reeves studied the card briefly. Then again. His expression remained neutral, but not satisfied. You live about 15 minutes from here, he observed. Yes. So why this route? I vary my training terrain. Training? He repeated the word lingering in his mouth as though testing its credibility. What kind of training? A small pause. Professional. Reeves gave a short, humorless laugh. That clears everything right up. Hale finished checking the serial number, reading the digits aloud quietly into the radio clipped to his vest. Static answered. Then silence, waiting for confirmation, waiting for discrepancy, waiting for proof of suspicion. Aaliyah glanced briefly at her watch at 52 a.m. 8 minutes until the warm-up briefing began at Fort Myer. 32 recruits would already be assembling near the conditioning field. 32 individuals expecting direction, structure, consistency. Responsibility did not pause for misunderstanding. Reeves noticed the glance. Running late for something important, he asked. Yes. What exactly would that be? Aaliyah's gaze remained steady. Work. Reeves tilted his head slightly as though amused by the simplicity of the answer. Well, he said slowly, depending on what we find here, your schedule might need adjusting. Hale stood, nodding slightly toward Reeves. No active stolen report matching this serial number yet, Hale said. The word yet hung noticeably in the air. Reeves considered that for a moment, then looked back toward Aaliyah. You understand how situations like this work, he said. High-value property draws attention. Another pause. And sometimes people try very hard to appear legitimate. The insinuation landed harder this time, more direct, more personal. Behind them, a teenager on a skateboard slowed to a stop, pulling out his phone and angling it for a clearer recording. Margaret Whitfield stepped closer to the curb, now her posture subtly expectant. She believed resolution was near. She believed confirmation would justify concern. She believed she had protected her neighborhood. Reeves shifted his stance again. "I'm going to need proof of purchase," he said. "Right now." Aaliyah reached calmly into her jacket pocket again, retrieving her phone. Her screen unlocked instantly. Her movements remained precise, controlled, efficient. Years of structured environments had shaped even the smallest gestures. She opened her email, typed a single keyword, scrolled briefly, then turned the screen outward. Digital receipt. Time-stamped. Store information clearly visible. Transaction amount $6,842.17. Date 14 months earlier. Reeves studied the screen. Then Hale leaned slightly closer to view. Neither spoke immediately. Across the street, Margaret's brow tightened slightly. Expectation shifting. Confidence recalibrating. Reeves handed the phone back slowly. "Well," he said, tone flattening slightly, "documentation can be fabricated." The words were quiet, but unmistakable. Another escalation, another barrier, another test of patience. Aaliyah nodded once. Calm. Unmoved. "If necessary," she said evenly, "you may contact the retailer directly." Reeves considered her for a long moment, long enough for the tension to settle heavily over the entire sidewalk, long enough for the watching crowd to feel something deeper than curiosity, long enough for the situation to evolve from simple inquiry into something unmistakably personal. Reeves exhaled slowly, then gestured subtly toward Hale. "Let's continue verification." The word "continue" implied unfinished suspicion, unresolved doubt, unspoken narrative still seeking confirmation. Aaliyah rested her hand lightly on the bicycle seat, steadying it upright again. Her voice remained composed. "You should be thorough," she said, then added quietly, "Very thorough." Reeves's eyes narrowed slightly, because confidence without defensiveness often signaled something unexpected, and something about her calm felt less like compliance and more like certainty. Something about this stop was no longer routine. Officer Reeves didn't like certainty in situations he believed he controlled. It disrupted the natural order of authority. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing once more at the sleek carbon frame before letting out a faint breath through his nose. "Well," he said slowly, "documentation can say many things." His tone was casual, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. "We've seen fake receipts before." The words were not loud, but they carried far enough for the small crowd gathering along the sidewalk to hear clearly. A young man in a gray hoodie tilted his phone slightly, making sure the audio would be captured. Another bystander whispered quietly, "This is getting uncomfortable." Margaret Whitfield stood near her SUV, now arms folded tightly, her earlier confidence beginning to thin at the edges. Officer Hale shifted closer to the bicycle again, crouching to examine the brake assembly. "Professional-grade hydraulic disc system. Precision engineering. Not a casual purchase. Mind explaining how you paid for it?" Reeves continued, his voice now layered with something sharper than curiosity. "Credit card," Aaliyah answered calmly. "Personal account, yes. Occupation," a brief pause. "Athletic performance instructor." Reeves lifted an eyebrow slightly. "That a full-time job, yes? Must be a pretty generous employer," he said lightly, though there was nothing light about the implication. The statement lingered. Heavy. Suggestive. Across the street, the teenage skateboarder muttered under his breath, "Man, just let her go." The dog walker beside him nodded faintly, but no one stepped forward. No one intervened. Observation felt safer than participation. Reeves extended his hand again. I'm going to need you to unlock the phone again. Aaliyah did not argue. She opened the banking app. Transaction history visible. Timestamp confirmed. Merchant name verified. Balance visible, though she angled the screen slightly to maintain privacy. Reeves studied the numbers longer this time, long enough for the narrative in his mind to begin adjusting but not dissolving. People often resisted abandoning first impressions, especially when those impressions felt reinforced by subtle bias. Who else has access to this bike? Hale asked suddenly. No one? You always store it inside, yes? Garage apartment interior. Anyone ever borrow it? No. Hale nodded once, though the questions continued, feeling less like verification and more like persistence. Reeves circled slowly around Aaliyah, now hands resting casually on his belt, eyes moving deliberately between her posture, her clothing, her bicycle. Evaluation disguised as procedure. You understand? Reeves said, lowering his voice slightly as though sharing reasonable logic. We get calls about stolen property in this area fairly often. Aaliyah met his gaze evenly. I understand procedure. Reeves paused briefly, then smiled faintly. But the smile did not reach his eyes. What I'm trying to understand, he continued, is how someone who doesn't appear to reside in this neighborhood happens to be riding equipment valued at nearly $7,000 at 6 in the morning. There it was again. Not accusation, but assumption layered with disbelief. Across the sidewalk. Margaret's posture shifted slightly, as if the officer's words restored some of her earlier confidence. The framing sounded familiar, comforting. Logical, if one accepted the premise. Aaliyah spoke calmly. I do not need to reside here to ride through here. Reeves nodded slowly. That's true. A pause. But people tend to notice unfamiliar activity when expensive property is involved. Another pause. And sometimes those observations help prevent crimes. Aaliyah allowed a small silence before answering. And sometimes they create them. The statement landed quietly, but its weight was unmistakable. The teenage bystander lowered his phone slightly, eyebrows lifting. Hale cleared his throat lightly, attempting to keep the interaction procedural. We're still verifying the serial number through dispatch, he said. Reeves nodded, then gestured casually toward the curb. For now, I'll need you to remain here. The phrasing sounded neutral, but the implied restriction was clear. Aaliyah rested her hands loosely at her sides, still calm, still composed, still patient. Years of professional discipline had trained her nervous system not to react to provocation. Emotion rarely improved outcomes in situations governed by perception, but that did not mean she failed to notice the pattern unfolding. The repeated doubt, the repeated insinuation, the repeated search for inconsistency. Margaret stepped closer again, now only 15 feet away, pretending to adjust something inside her trunk while her attention remained fully fixed on the interaction. Her earlier certainty had shifted into quiet vigilance. She wanted confirmation, closure, reassurance that her instinct had not been misplaced. Aaliyah glanced briefly at her watch again. 5:57 a.m. 3 minutes. Her recruits would already be assembling near the field entrance, laces tightened, equipment checked, expectations forming, responsibility weighted. Reeves noticed the glance again. You seem concerned about time, he observed. I am, Aaliyah answered. You have somewhere important to be, yes. Reeves tilted his head slightly. You mind sharing where Aaliyah paused? Not because she lacked an answer, but because experience had taught her something crucial. Information offered too early could sometimes invite additional scrutiny rather than resolution. I am scheduled to begin work shortly. Reeves nodded slowly. Well, he said calmly, depending on how long this takes, you may need to inform your employer you'll be delayed. The suggestion carried an edge, an assumption that her explanation would need justification. Hale's radio crackled softly. Dispatch requesting confirmation of additional identifiers. Reeves answered quickly, providing the serial digits again. Waiting. Static. Processing. The seconds stretched. The watching crowd grew slightly larger. Morning routines disrupted. Curiosity magnetized attention. Margaret checked her watch briefly, then returned her gaze to the scene, expecting resolution, expecting validation, expecting to be right. Reeves exhaled again, glancing toward Aaliyah with a measured expression. You understand, he said. Cooperation usually helps situations conclude faster. I am cooperating, she replied evenly. Another pause. Another moment of stillness that seemed to challenge the narrative forming in his mind. Confidence without defensiveness often created discomfort for those expecting resistance, because resistance justified escalation. Calm required reconsideration, and reconsideration required humility. Reeves shifted slightly, his fingers tapping lightly against the leather of his belt. Let me ask you directly, he said. Is there any reason someone would believe this bicycle does not belong to you? Aaliyah considered the question carefully, then answered with quiet precision, yes. Reeves's eyebrows lifted slightly. And what reason would that be? She held his gaze steadily. Because assumptions are often made before questions are fully asked. The statement hung in the air, measured, controlled, unmistakably deliberate. Hale glanced briefly toward Reeves. Reeves said nothing for several seconds. The silence lengthened. Then the radio crackled again. Dispatch voice clearer this time. Serial number matches registered purchase. No theft report associated with this unit. Hale nodded once, but Reeves did not immediately respond. Because sometimes, being wrong in public felt more uncomfortable than continuing to search for a reason not to be. Reeves finally spoke. Verification can take time to update, he said evenly. We'll continue confirming, another extension, another delay, another test of patience. Aaliyah simply nodded once, because she already understood something they did not. The longer this continued, the more visible the truth would become. And visibility had a way of changing outcomes by 6:02 a.m. The quiet street no longer felt quiet. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in the polished windows of nearby homes, creating an atmosphere that felt far more dramatic than the situation itself should have required. A routine morning had slowly transformed into something heavier, something public, and public pressure had a way of amplifying everything. A gray sedan slowed as it passed the driver, turning his head just long enough to capture a quick video clip through the open passenger window. Across the street, the teenage skateboarder had now switched to live stream mode, his voice low but excited. Police got this woman stopped over a stolen bike or something. The narrative was already forming online. Incomplete. Unverified. But spreading. Aaliyah remained standing beside her bicycle posture, relaxed but attentive. She did not cross her arms. She did not sigh. She did not display irritation, though the repeated delay was now clearly unnecessary. Officer Reeves, however, seemed increasingly aware of the growing audience. Authority performed differently when observed. So, he said, his voice slightly louder now, as though addressing not only Aaliyah, but the small circle of witnesses forming around them. You said you purchased this bike yourself. Yes. You live 15 minutes away. Yes. You don't typically ride through this neighborhood. I vary my training routes. Reeves gave a small, almost theatrical nod, as if presenting the information for evaluation. And you just happen to be riding a high-end performance bicycle, matching the description of one reported missing earlier this week. The phrasing again suggested conclusion before confirmation. A middle-aged man in running gear slowed his jog earbuds dangling around his neck as curiosity overtook routine. That doesn't even sound like evidence, he muttered quietly. Margaret Whitfield heard him. Her jaw tightened slightly. She had expected smoother validation, cleaner confirmation. Instead, uncertainty had begun creeping into the edges of the situation. Officer Hale stepped slightly aside, speaking quietly into his radio again, requesting confirmation from a second database. Procedure continuing, because sometimes the appearance of diligence felt safer than admitting the conclusion had come too quickly. Reeves crouched briefly beside the bicycle again, examining the brand insignia more carefully. These models usually require custom fitting, he said casually. Yes, Aaliyah replied. So you must be quite serious about cycling. I am serious about maintaining operational fitness. The phrasing caused Hale to glance briefly upward. Operational, not recreational. A subtle difference. But Reeves continued pressing. You compete, number professional athlete, number. Reeves tilted his head slightly, as though the answer failed to align with his expectation. Then what exactly requires equipment at this level? The question sounded neutral, but the implication suggested disbelief. Aaliyah answered calmly. My work requires endurance conditioning. Reeves exhaled softly. Many jobs require staying in shape. The implication lingered. Why this bike? Why this person? Why here? Why now? Behind them, the skateboarder shifted slightly closer, zooming in carefully. This is wild, he whispered to his livestream audience. They really not letting her leave. Margaret checked her phone again, noticing that 2 neighbors from the community chat had already asked about the police presence on Maplewood. The situation had begun expanding beyond the physical location. Perception now multiplied digitally. Aaliyah's phone vibrated again. 600 briefing reminder now marked missed. Her recruits would have begun warm-up stretches without her. One of the assistant instructors would have taken temporary lead. But structure disrupted often led to inefficiency, and inefficiency in training environments carried consequences. Reeves noticed the vibration. You're receiving quite a few notifications, he said. Yes. Work. Yes. Reeves nodded slowly. What kind of employer expects staff to ride expensive equipment through residential neighborhoods before sunrise? Aaliyah answered evenly. The kind that values preparedness. The statement sounded simple, but Hale glanced up again. Something about her composure did not align with the narrative Reeves appeared intent on maintaining. Dispatch already confirmed no theft report, Hale said quietly. Reeves gave a small nod, though his eyes remained focused on Aaliyah. Calls can still be investigated, he replied. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. The jogger who had paused earlier now spoke quietly to the dog walker beside him. They already confirmed the bike isn't stolen. Then why is this still happening? The dog walker whispered. Good question. One Reeves did not acknowledge. Because sometimes stopping the process required acknowledging the process had gone too far, and acknowledgement required accountability. Reeves stood again, resting his hands on his hips. You understand? He said calmly. We're simply ensuring everything checks out. Aaliyah met his gaze. I understand. A brief silence followed. Then Reeves added, high-value items attract attention. The phrase had now been repeated 3 times, as though repetition might justify persistence, as though value itself required explanation, as though ownership required demonstration beyond evidence. Across the street, Margaret finally stepped closer, her voice careful but audible. I'm the one who made the call. Several heads turned. Reeves acknowledged her with a small nod. "Ma'am, thank you for your vigilance," he said. The phrasing restored a degree of validation she had been waiting to hear. "I just thought it was better to be safe," Margaret added, her voice tight but composed. "We've had incidents recently." "What kind of incidents?" the jogger asked quietly. Margaret hesitated. "Well, suspicious activity." The vagueness lingered. Undefined. Unverified. But powerful enough to initiate consequences. Aaliyah listened silently. She had encountered variations of this moment before. Concern framed as responsibility. Suspicion framed as protection. Assumption framed as caution. Reeves turned slightly back toward Aaliyah. "You see," he said calmly, "members of the community rely on us to follow up when something appears inconsistent. Inconsistent with what Aaliyah asked quietly." Reeves paused briefly, then answered carefully, with expected patterns. There it was, said indirectly, but clearly understood. The teenager's live stream chat began filling with comments. "Why is this still going?" They already checked the bike. "Let her go. Pressure building. Visibility increasing. Narratives shifting." Hale's radio crackled again. Clear confirmation repeated. No stolen report associated with that serial number. Reeves nodded slowly, then looked back toward Aaliyah. For the first time, uncertainty flickered briefly behind his eyes, but pride resisted quick reversal, because authority rarely enjoyed being questioned publicly, especially when certainty had been expressed confidently moments earlier. Reeves inhaled slowly, then spoke. "Just one more question." The phrase landed heavier than expected, because one more question often meant something else entirely. "What exactly is your line of work?" Aaliyah held his gaze, calm, measured, unshaken. The bystanders leaned slightly closer. Even Margaret watched more carefully now, because something about the question felt like the edge of a turning point. Aaliyah answered simply, "I train individuals whose job requires performing under pressure." Reeves nodded slowly. "And what kind of job would that be?" A brief pause. Then Aaliyah replied, "The kind where hesitation can cost lives." The words settled heavily into the morning air. Something shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable, because confidence grounded in truth carried a different weight. And suddenly, the situation no longer felt as predictable as it once had. The air felt tighter now. What had begun as a routine stop had quietly transformed into something heavier, something layered with implication. Officer Reeves shifted his stance, folding his arms briefly before letting them fall again to rest near his belt. His eyes moved from Aaliyah's calm expression to the bicycle once more, as if hoping the object itself might reveal some hidden contradiction. "You train people for high-pressure jobs," Reeves repeated slowly, tasting the words as though searching for weakness in their structure. "Yes," Aaliyah answered. "What kind of institution are we talking about, a federal training program?" Reeves nodded faintly, though his skepticism did not fade. "A lot of people use that phrase loosely," he replied. The comment sounded casual, but its meaning was pointed. Behind them, the small crowd had grown to nearly a dozen onlookers. Morning routines paused, coffee cups forgotten mid-sip, phone cameras held steady. Moments like this attracted attention because they felt unfinished. Unresolved tension acted like gravity. Hale stepped slightly closer to Reeves, lowering his voice. "Everything checks out so far," he murmured. Reeves gave a small nod, but his eyes did not leave Aaliyah. "Let's go over this once more," Reeves said now, speaking louder again, performing procedure for the audience. "You were reported as a suspicious individual riding through a residential neighborhood on a high-value bicycle, matching a recently posted missing item." The phrasing subtly shifted again. Not stolen. Missing. ambiguous enough to maintain justification. You do not reside in this neighborhood. No. You are unable to immediately provide physical documentation. I have provided digital documentation. Reeves tilted his head slightly, which can sometimes be altered. Another insinuation, another extension, another attempt to preserve the original assumption. Across the sidewalk, the teenage live streamer whispered, "They just keep going." The jogger beside him shook his head slowly. Margaret Whitfield shifted her posture again. Her earlier confidence now replaced by something more complicated. She had expected resolution by now, clear confirmation. Instead, uncertainty had begun reflecting back toward her. Aaliyah remained composed. Years of leadership training had taught her that tone often influenced trajectory. Escalation rarely improved outcomes, but silence did not mean submission. "I have complied with every request," she said evenly. Reeves nodded. "Yes." A pause. "Yet we still need to ensure everything aligns." The repetition sounded increasingly hollow. Even Hale seemed aware of it now. "We could call the retailer," Hale suggested quietly. Reeves ignored the suggestion, because ending the interaction now would require acknowledging that continuation had become unnecessary. Authority sometimes resisted premature closure, particularly when public confidence had already been projected. Reeves gestured lightly toward the curb. "For now, I need you to remain off the bicycle." "I am already off the bicycle. Remain beside it. I am beside it." The exchange sounded procedural, but its redundancy revealed something else, a search for continued control. Reeves's fingers rested briefly against the metal of his handcuffs. Not gripping, not drawing, simply touching. A gesture subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but visible enough to communicate potential escalation. The movement did not go unnoticed. The dog walker inhaled sharply. The teenager's live stream chat filled with reactions. "Why is he touching the cuffs? This is too much." Aaliyah's posture remained unchanged, balanced. Still, her breathing slow and steady. She had trained hundreds of recruits to maintain composure in environments designed to provoke reaction. She would not abandon her own standards now. Reeves spoke again. "You understand that failure to cooperate can create additional complications." "I am cooperating." "Yes." Another pause. "But sometimes cooperation requires patience. I am being patient." Reeves's jaw tightened slightly, because calm responses left little room for authority to expand. Hale shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interaction had taken. "Dispatch confirmed the serial twice," he said quietly. "No theft report." Reeves exhaled slowly, then turned slightly toward Aaliyah again. "Is there any reason someone would associate you with prior suspicious activity in this area?" The question landed heavily, because it was no longer about the bicycle. It was about perception, about presence, about belonging. Aaliyah answered carefully. "No." Reeves studied her face for several seconds, then spoke again. "Do you regularly travel through neighborhoods where residents might not recognize you?" "Yes." "And do you understand how unfamiliar presence combined with high-value property can create concern?" Aaliyah held his gaze. "Yes." Reeves nodded once. "As officers, we are obligated to investigate when concerns are raised." "I understand your obligation," she said calmly. A small silence followed. Then she added, "I also understand when assumptions precede evidence." The words settled quietly but firmly. Across the street, Margaret lowered her arms. Something about the statement unsettled her, because the situation no longer looked like vigilance. It looked like persistence, searching for justification. Reeves glanced briefly toward the small audience, now clearly questioning the necessity of continued scrutiny. Authority performed best when supported by confidence. Public doubt complicated that performance. Reeves made a small gesture toward Hale. "Let's verify again," he said. Hale hesitated. "We already did." Again. Because repetition created the appearance of thoroughness, and thoroughness created the illusion of justification. Hale spoke quietly into the radio once more, repeating the same serial digits, waiting for the same answer. The seconds stretched. Morning sunlight now stronger against the pavement. Time moving. Responsibility waiting elsewhere. Aaliyah glanced briefly at her watch again. 6:09 a.m. 9 minutes into the scheduled warm-up window. 32 recruits already compensating for absence. Leadership required reliability. Reliability required trust. Trust required consistency. And consistency was now being tested publicly. Reeves followed her glance. "You seem very confident this situation will resolve quickly," he observed. Aaliyah nodded once. "Yes. What gives you that confidence?" She paused, then answered quietly, "Because facts do not change under pressure." The statement lingered longer than expected. Because certainty grounded in truth rarely required volume. Only patience. Hale's radio crackled again. Clear. Unchanged. "No theft record associated with that bicycle." Reeves remained silent for several seconds, because admitting error in front of witnesses often felt heavier than maintaining momentum. Finally he spoke. "Sometimes stolen property is not reported immediately." Another extension, another possibility, another attempt to preserve narrative. But the crowd no longer appeared convinced. Even Margaret Whitfield shifted uncomfortably now, because the situation she had initiated no longer looked protective. It looked disproportionate. Reeves adjusted his stance again. "One final attempt to maintain control. Until we are fully satisfied," he said, "we will continue ensuring this property is lawfully possessed." The phrasing sounded official, but something in the tone had changed. Less certainty, more hesitation, because confidence began eroding when facts refused to cooperate with assumptions. Aaliyah's voice remained steady. "You should complete your process," she said, then added calmly, "I am certain the outcome will become clear." Reeves studied her for a long moment, because confidence without defensiveness often signaled something he had not yet accounted for. And something about her composure suggested this interaction was approaching a turning point he had not anticipated. By 6:12 a.m., the morning sun had fully risen above the rooftops of Maplewood Avenue, casting long golden lines across the pavement. The flashing police lights now felt unnecessary, almost theatrical, yet they remained active, silently reinforcing the image of wrongdoing where none had been proven. Captain Aaliyah Brooks stood beside her bicycle, one hand resting lightly on the saddle, her posture unchanged despite the prolonged scrutiny. Discipline had trained her to remain composed even when circumstances invited frustration. Across the small crowd, whispers had shifted tone. Curiosity had turned into discomfort. Discomfort had turned into quiet questioning, because the facts had already been confirmed. And yet the stop continued. Officer Reeves cleared his throat softly, glancing briefly at the growing number of phones pointed in his direction. Visibility complicated confidence. Public attention often forced decisions faster than internal hesitation preferred. "Well," Reeves said, his voice controlled, but carrying an edge of defensiveness, "understand that we're simply ensuring all aspects of this situation are fully verified." Aaliyah nodded once. "I understand verification." A small pause followed. Then she added calmly, "What I do not understand is repetition after verification." The statement landed quietly, but several bystanders shifted slightly, acknowledging the point without speaking. Officer Hale adjusted his radio mic, clearly uncomfortable now with the continued direction of the stop. "Dispatch confirmed twice," he said quietly. Reeves exhaled through his nose. We are still responsible for resolving the original call. Across the street, Margaret Whitfield's confidence had now noticeably weakened. Her arms were no longer folded. Her posture no longer projected certainty. Instead, she watched with the unsettled expression of someone beginning to reconsider the assumptions that had felt obvious only 20 minutes earlier. Aaliyah reached slowly into the pocket of her athletic jacket. Both officers immediately noticed the movement. Her voice remained calm and procedural. "I am retrieving my phone." Reeves nodded once. Slowly. She unlocked the screen with practiced efficiency, scrolling briefly through her contacts list. Reeves watched carefully. "You calling someone?" he asked. "Yes." "Who?" "A colleague." Reeves tilted his head slightly. "A colleague can't override procedure." "I am not asking anyone to override procedure." Her thumb hovered briefly over the contact name, then pressed. The call connected almost immediately. She raised the phone to her ear. "Brooks," she said simply. Her tone had changed not in warmth, not in volume, but in structure. Direct, efficient, professional. "Yes," she continued calmly. "I will be delayed approximately 15 minutes. A short pause. Her eyes remained on Reeves. "Yes." Another pause. "Then I am currently being detained regarding a bicycle ownership verification." A longer silence followed. Those closest to her could faintly hear the voice responding through the speaker, male authoritative, immediately alert. Location. She provided the intersection calmly. Reeves shifted slightly, listening carefully, despite maintaining neutral posture. "Yes," Aaliyah continued. "2 patrol units present." Pause. "Yes." Another pause. Then, "No, I do not anticipate escalation." Her gaze remained steady. "I will update shortly." She ended the call. Reeves raised an eyebrow slightly. "That your employer?" "Yes." "What do you do that requires this level of coordination?" Aaliyah answered simply. "I maintain training schedules that cannot be delayed, without consequence." Reeves smirked faintly. "Sounds important." "It is." Across the sidewalk, the teenage live streamer whispered, "She talks like military or something." The jogger beside him nodded faintly. Hale glanced briefly toward Reeves. Something in Aaliyah's tone had shifted the atmosphere. Subtle, but unmistakable. Because confidence grounded in structure often revealed hierarchy without announcing it. Reeves folded his arms loosely. "Well," he said, "until everything is completely resolved, we'll continue with the process." Aaliyah inclined her head slightly. "I expected that." Margaret Whitfield now appeared less certain of her position. She adjusted the strap of her handbag repeatedly, her gaze moving between the officers and Aaliyah with growing hesitation, because the narrative she had imagined was no longer unfolding as expected. Instead of defensiveness, there was composure. Instead of evasion, there was patience. Instead of contradiction, there was quiet certainty. Aaliyah glanced briefly at her watch again, at 17 a.m. Her recruits would now be transitioning into mobility drills. Assistant instructors would maintain order. But structure functioned best under consistency. Reeves noticed the glance again. "You operate on a very strict schedule," he observed. "Yes. What happens if you miss it?" "Others compensate. But it creates inefficiency." "Yes." Reeves nodded slowly. "Well," he said almost casually, "today may involve some inefficiency." Aaliyah's expression remained unchanged. "Temporary inefficiency is acceptable." Another pause. "Unnecessary escalation is not." The words were calm, but firm. Hale exhaled quietly. Even Reeves seemed to recognize the shift. Because this interaction was no longer about a bicycle. It was about judgment, perception, authority, and the consequences of assumptions made too quickly. Across the street, Margaret finally spoke again. Her voice softer this time. I only wanted to make sure everything was all right. Aaliyah turned her head slightly toward her. Her tone remained neutral. Everything is all right. The statement carried no accusation, no anger, no visible resentment, only clarity. Margaret nodded faintly, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. Reeves adjusted his stance again. Just to be thorough, he said, "We will complete one final confirmation." The phrase sounded increasingly fragile, because repetition without new evidence often revealed something else entirely reluctance to conclude. Aaliyah rested her hand lightly on the bicycle again. Her voice remained steady. "You should complete whatever process you believe necessary." Then she added quietly, "I am confident it will not take much longer." Reeves studied her expression carefully, because certainty without defensiveness often indicated access to information others did not yet possess. And something about her calm suggested resolution was approaching from a direction he had not yet considered. Far down the street, the low hum of an approaching vehicle began to grow faintly louder. At first no one noticed, but within moments, the atmosphere was about to change. The phone call had lasted less than 30 seconds, but something in Aaliyah's tone during that call had altered the air around her. It was not louder, not more emotional, just different, structured, precise, controlled in a way that suggested routine familiarity with authority rather than dependence on it. Officer Reeves noticed it immediately. People under pressure often spoke faster, defensively, emotionally, but Aaliyah had spoken like someone updating a schedule. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, at 6:18 a.m., the silence stretched across Maplewood Avenue in a way that made every small sound feel amplified. A car door closing in the distance, a dog barking 2 houses away, the faint hum of a lawn sprinkler activating. Ordinary sounds suddenly felt sharp, noticeable, because everyone present sensed the moment shifting. Officer Hale's radio crackled again. "Dispatch confirms again no theft report associated with that serial number." The confirmation was now official for the 3rd time. Procedure had reached its conclusion. Yet Reeves did not immediately step aside. Because stepping aside required acknowledging the stop had gone further than necessary. And acknowledgement, especially in public, often felt heavier than persistence. Aaliyah stood calmly, her hand resting lightly on the handlebar grip. Her breathing remained slow and steady. Years of training had taught her that pressure often revealed character not only in others, but in oneself. Reeves shifted his stance. "You understand," he said, as if attempting to maintain procedural framing. "Initial reports can sometimes be incomplete." "I understand," Aaliyah replied evenly. "And sometimes stolen items are not reported immediately." "I understand." Reeves nodded slowly, still searching, still attempting to justify continuation, still reluctant to conclude. Across the street, Margaret Whitfield no longer looked confident. Her earlier certainty had been replaced by discomfort she could not easily explain, because what had seemed obvious 20 minutes earlier now felt uncertain. The teenager live streaming the encounter whispered, "They already confirmed the bike isn't stolen. What else are they checking?" The comment section of his live stream began filling rapidly. "Why is she still being stopped? This doesn't look right." Visibility had shifted the balance of pressure. Public observation rarely allowed assumptions to remain hidden. Aaliyah's phone vibrated once more in her hand. A new message notification. Short, direct. She read it briefly, then locked the screen again. Reeves noticed. Expecting someone, he asked. Yes. Who? A colleague. Reeves gave a faint smile. A colleague with influence. Aaliyah did not respond to the implication. Instead, she simply said, a colleague familiar with my schedule. The phrasing sounded neutral, but Hale glanced briefly toward Reeves. Something about the interaction no longer aligned with the original narrative, because individuals attempting deception rarely invited additional scrutiny. They avoided attention. They sought quick exit. Aaliyah had done neither. Instead, she had waited. Calm. Certain. Still. The low sound of an approaching vehicle began to echo faintly from the far end of Maplewood Avenue. At first, no one paid attention. Morning traffic was normal. Routine. But as the vehicle drew closer, its steady speed and controlled approach subtly captured Hale's attention. He turned slightly, noticing the government-issued plates before the SUV had even turned fully onto the street. Dark gray, unmarked, but unmistakably official. Reeves followed his gaze. The vehicle slowed gradually, stopping approximately 40 feet from the scene. The engine remained running momentarily, then turned off. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, early 50s, composed posture, measured movements. No visible urgency, but clear purpose. He wore neutral training attire, athletic jacket, minimal markings, but carried himself with unmistakable confidence, shaped by long experience in structured environments. His eyes scanned the scene once, quickly, efficiently. 2 patrol vehicles, gathered bystanders, phones raised. Then, his gaze settled on Aaliyah. Recognition appeared immediately. Captain Brooks. The words were calm, matter-of-fact, but unmistakable. Aaliyah inclined her head slightly. Colonel Harris. Officer Hale's posture straightened instinctively. Titles mattered. Context mattered. Reeves felt the subtle shift before fully understanding it. Colonel David Harris approached with steady steps, stopping a respectful distance from the officers. "Good morning," Harris said evenly. Reeves nodded. "Morning, sir." Harris glanced briefly toward the bicycle lying momentarily against the curb, then back toward Aaliyah. "I received your update." "Yes, sir," Aaliyah replied. Harris turned toward Reeves. "Has an issue been identified?" Reeves answered carefully. "A report was made regarding a bicycle matching the description of recently posted missing property." Harris nodded once. "And verification?" Hale spoke this time. "Serial number confirmed, registered purchase." Harris paused briefly, allowing the statement to settle. "Then the matter appears resolved." Reeves shifted slightly. "We are completing procedural review." Harris studied him calmly. "What procedural element remains unresolved?" The question was neutral, professional, but precise. Reeves hesitated, only briefly, but noticeably. Margaret Whitfield lowered her gaze slightly, suddenly aware that the situation she had initiated had reached a level she had not anticipated. Harris folded his hands loosely in front of him. "Captain Brooks supervises conditioning programs for individuals entering specialized service environments," he said calmly. "She maintains a strict training schedule involving multiple personnel." He glanced briefly at his watch. "Those personnel are currently waiting." The statement was factual, but its implication was clear. Time had been lost. Reeves nodded slowly, understanding beginning to replace assumption. Public attention intensifying the weight of recognition. Harris looked toward Aaliyah. "Is there any remaining obstacle preventing departure?" Aaliyah answered calmly. "I am awaiting clearance." All eyes shifted toward Reeves, because now the conclusion required acknowledgement. Reeves exhaled slowly, then nodded once. "You are free to go." The words sounded simple, but their arrival had taken far longer than evidence required. A small shift moved through the watching crowd. Validation, relief, quiet realization. Margaret stepped back toward her vehicle, her certainty no longer intact. Aaliyah lifted the bicycle smoothly, checking the front alignment briefly. Her composure remained unchanged. No triumph, no visible frustration, only professionalism. Because discipline did not depend on apology, it depended on consistency. As she prepared to continue her route, Harris spoke quietly. Assessment window, adjusted to 0630. Aaliyah nodded once. Understood. She mounted the bicycle in one fluid motion. Reeves stepped aside, the path now clear, but the atmosphere remained altered. Because moments like this did not simply disappear. They lingered. In memory. In perception. In consequence. And sometimes, the real impact of a moment was only beginning. Colonel David Harris did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. Instead, he allowed the weight of the situation to reveal itself naturally, something far more uncomfortable than confrontation. Officer Reeves suddenly became aware of how many phones were now pointed in his direction. 10 minutes earlier, the stop had felt routine. Now it felt exposed, because the presence of Colonel Harris had introduced context that could not easily be ignored. Harris stood beside Aaliyah with quiet composure, hands relaxed, posture upright, eyes observant, but calm. He did not project intimidation. He did not need to. Authority often spoke most clearly when it did not try to. Officer Harris said evenly, "Please clarify the current concern." Reeves shifted slightly, aware that the answer now required precision. "We received a call reporting a bicycle matching the description of a recently listed stolen item." Harris nodded once. "And what did verification conclude?" Officer Hale answered without hesitation. "Serial number confirmed, legitimate purchase. No theft report connected to the frame." Harris paused, then asked the question that changed everything. "Then what justification remains for continued detention?" The word detention landed quietly but heavily, because no one had used that word yet, and now it could not be unheard. Reeves cleared his throat. "We are ensuring procedural accuracy." Harris considered that calmly. "Procedural accuracy requires evidence." A brief pause followed. "And evidence has now been confirmed." The bystanders exchanged glances. The teenager live streaming whispered, "He just said detention." Comments began appearing rapidly. "This is getting serious. They really kept her here with no proof." Visibility had shifted the balance of the interaction, because public observation often forced clarity where assumption once operated comfortably. Harris continued speaking calmly. "Captain Brooks maintains federal-level certification in tactical endurance preparation." Several people in the crowd straightened slightly, as though the description itself carried gravity. "She oversees conditioning readiness for individuals entering high-responsibility service environments." He did not specify further. He did not need to. The implications spoke for themselves. The calm woman who had been questioned repeatedly about the ownership of her bicycle was responsible for preparing individuals trusted with national security responsibilities. The contrast sharpened the realization spreading quietly through the small crowd. Reeves nodded slowly, understanding now replacing assumption. Because context had restructured the narrative entirely. Margaret Whitfield felt a growing discomfort settle in her chest. Her earlier certainty now felt fragile, incomplete, because what had appeared suspicious had now revealed itself as routine discipline belonging to a world she did not fully understand. Harris glanced briefly at his watch. "Captain Brooks is scheduled to supervise a conditioning rotation beginning at 0600 hours. He allowed the time reference to settle. Structured language carried quiet authority. "We are now 23 minutes behind schedule." The statement remained factual, but its meaning was unmistakable. 32 recruits were waiting. 32 schedules temporarily disrupted. 32 training sequences adjusted, because assumption had interrupted structure. Harris returned his attention to Reeves. "Does any verifiable evidence suggest Captain Brooks is in unlawful possession of this property?" Reeves answered quietly. "No. Has any conflicting ownership claim been identified? Has any report been filed identifying this specific bicycle as stolen?" Each answer narrowed the space available for continued delay. Each answer moved the moment closer to acknowledgement. Across the sidewalk, the jogger whispered quietly, "They had no reason to keep her here this long." The dog walker nodded slowly. Margaret lowered her gaze briefly, feeling the uncomfortable realization that her call had triggered consequences she had not anticipated, because assumption once acted upon rarely remained small. Harris spoke calmly. "Captain Brooks trains individuals expected to make high-stakes decisions under pressure." A brief pause. Composure in those environments is not optional. The relevance did not go unnoticed. Because the composure Aaliyah had demonstrated throughout the encounter now reflected professional discipline rather than simple patience. Reeves exhaled slowly, then nodded. "You are free to continue your route, this time without hesitation." The words arrived cleanly, decisively, aligned with the facts already confirmed multiple times. Aaliyah inclined her head once. No visible frustration, no display of relief, no outward reaction at all. Because discipline did not fluctuate based on circumstance, it remained constant. She lifted the bicycle smoothly, checking the alignment of the handlebars where it had struck the pavement earlier. Her movements remained precise, economical, efficient, the same characteristics she demanded from every recruit she trained. Colonel Harris stepped slightly aside, clearing the path completely. Margaret Whitfield finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "I only wanted to be careful." Aaliyah looked toward her briefly, her expression calm, measured. Carefulness requires complete information. The statement contained no accusation, only clarity. Margaret nodded faintly, absorbing the quiet correction delivered without hostility. Across the street, the teenager ended his live stream, shaking his head slightly. "That changed fast," he murmured. But the shift had not happened suddenly. It had happened gradually. The moment evidence entered the conversation, the moment context became visible, the moment assumption encountered fact. Harris spoke quietly. "Assessment window, adjusted to 0630. Aaliyah nodded once. "I will be prepared." She placed one foot onto the pedal, pushing forward smoothly. The carbon wheels rotated silently, cutting through the morning air with the same quiet efficiency as before the stop began. Routine resumed. Responsibility continued. But perception had changed. Behind her, the small crowd slowly dispersed, their conversations quieter, now more reflective than curious. Officer Hale adjusted the position of his radio. Reeves removed his gloves slowly, the tearing sound of Velcro unusually loud in the morning stillness. Neither officer spoke immediately, because recognition often arrived silently. The flashing patrol lights finally powered off, artificial urgency replaced by natural daylight. Colonel Harris remained standing, momentarily watching Aaliyah disappear down the street, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. Because professionalism did not require vindication. It required consistency. As Harris returned to his vehicle, one quiet truth lingered in the air. The situation had never truly been about the bicycle. It had been about perception, expectation, assumption, and the quiet strength required to remain composed, long enough for truth to reveal itself. The moment Captain Aaliyah Brooks turned the corner at the end of Maplewood Avenue, the rhythm of her pedaling returned to its natural cadence, steady, controlled, efficient. But the delay had not been insignificant. 23 minutes in military training schedules did not simply disappear. They created adjustments, recalculations, quiet disruptions that required leadership to restore order without allowing frustration to weaken discipline. By 6:31 a.m., the wide training grounds of Fort Myer were already alive with motion. Lines of recruits moved across the field in synchronized warm-up drills, each repetition timed to the quiet commands of assistant instructors, filling the temporary gap created by Aaliyah's absence. 32 recruits, ages ranging from 21 to 34. Each selected through a process designed to identify not only strength, but composure under pressure. Each aware that today's assessment rotation would determine their advancement into specialized operational preparation tracks. As Aaliyah approached the secured gate, the guard stationed at the entrance immediately straightened. Morning, Captain Brooks. Her presence alone restored structure. No explanation required. No announcement necessary. Professional environments operated on consistency, and consistency had returned. Inside the conditioning field, Sergeant Marcus Ellison checked his watch again, 6:32 a.m. He had already adjusted the warm-up sequence twice, extending mobility rotations to maintain readiness without fatiguing the recruits prematurely, because conditioning leadership required precision. Too little challenge weakened outcomes. Too much pressure created avoidable injury risk. When Aaliyah stepped onto the field, conversations stopped immediately. Not because she demanded silence, because her presence naturally commanded focus. Sergeant Ellison nodded once. Schedule adjusted, Aaliyah acknowledged with a single nod. Status warm-up phase extended. Hydration levels stable. No issues. She stepped forward, her voice calm but precise. Transition to Endurance Circuit Alpha. 32 recruits moved instantly. No hesitation, no confusion, because preparation rewarded clarity. As the first group began sprint interval rotations, Colonel Harris approached from the observation line, hands folded behind his back. You maintained composure, he said quietly. Aaliyah did not break her focus on the recruits completing their first repetition cycle. Procedure concluded. Harris nodded once. The officers did not initially recognize the context. That is common. A brief pause followed, because both understood the meaning beneath the words. Not rare, not unusual, not unexpected, but still consequential. Harris observed the recruits moving through resistance drills, their timing tight, their breathing controlled. You are aware the incident was recorded, he said calmly. Yes, likely circulating already. Aaliyah nodded slightly. Visibility often accelerates accountability. Harris allowed the statement to settle, because leadership environments often required patience beyond the moment itself. Across the training ground, recruit Daniel Ortiz struggled slightly during the third sprint repetition. Fatigue visible. Form weakening. Aaliyah moved immediately, her voice firm but controlled. Ortiz regulate breathing. Pace consistency. Ortiz adjusted instantly, because discipline responded to clarity, not emotion. Harris observed quietly. Interesting contrast, he said. Aaliyah glanced briefly in his direction. Between the assumptions placed upon you this morning and the responsibility you carry here. She did not immediately respond, because the contrast required no explanation. The recruits completed the interval set. Sweat visible, breathing controlled, fatigue managed, growth occurring. Aaliyah gathered the group briefly. Pressure reveals preparation, she said, her voice calm, steady, measured. External distraction does not alter internal standards. Several recruits nodded subtly, because those words applied far beyond physical training. Harris spoke quietly once the group returned to position. Command has already been informed of the delay. Aaliyah's expression remained neutral. Understood. The training schedule remains unchanged. Correct. Because responsibility did not pause for inconvenience. It adapted, recovered, continued. As the recruits moved into resistance carry drills, Harris added, "The department will likely review the circumstances of the stop." Aaliyah adjusted the timing device on her wrist. "That is procedural." Harris studied her briefly. "You do not appear surprised." She shook her head slightly. Assumption often reveals itself under observation. The statement reflected experience, not bitterness, because repeated exposure often produced clarity rather than anger. Across the field, the recruits lifted weighted carry sleds moving in synchronized effort across the marked lanes, breathing controlled, focus sharpened, preparation ongoing. Harris spoke again. "You maintained composure under public scrutiny. That is part of the job, because composure trained others to maintain composure. Leadership required consistency, not reaction, not performance, consistency." Sergeant Ellison approached with updated performance metrics displayed on a digital tablet. "Heart rate recovery times improving," he reported. Aaliyah reviewed the data quickly. "Adjust resistance levels by 8%. Ellison nodded immediately. "Because trust in leadership reduced hesitation." Harris observed the interaction carefully. "Interesting," he said. "What you did not attempt to accelerate departure from the stop." No. Why Aaliyah watched the recruits carefully. Composure is most visible when tested. Harris nodded slowly. Because the statement reflected not theory, but discipline lived consistently. The recruits completed the next interval. Fatigue evident. Determination stronger. Progress measurable. Harris added quietly. "Situations like this often create ripple effects." Aaliyah nodded slightly. "Visibility encourages reflection, because public observation often forced systems to evaluate themselves, not always immediately, but inevitably. The training cycle continued uninterrupted, structure restored, momentum regained, responsibility fulfilled, because while the morning had introduced distraction, discipline had restored direction. Across the field, Ortiz completed the final carry repetition, breathing heavily, but maintaining form. Improvement visible. Progress earned. Aaliyah addressed the group briefly. Performance consistency determines operational reliability. 32 recruits listened carefully, because credibility came from example, and example had been demonstrated long before sunrise. Harris watched the training sequence conclude its current phase, then spoke quietly. "The individuals you prepare will one day make decisions affecting lives." Aaliyah nodded once. "That is why standards remain constant. Because pressure did not create discipline. It revealed it. And the events of that morning had revealed something clearly. Composure did not depend on circumstance. It depended on identity. Identity shaped through discipline. Maintained through consistency, proven through action. As the recruits reset for the next conditioning phase, the rhythm of preparation resumed fully. But beyond the training field, the story of Maplewood Avenue was already beginning its next phase, because truth once witnessed rarely remained silent. By 8:47 a.m., the video from Maplewood Avenue had already begun circulating beyond the small circle of witnesses who had originally recorded it. It started quietly. One live stream clip, 37 viewers, then 72, then 200. Within an hour, a short, edited version appeared on multiple social media platforms, condensed into 93 seconds that captured the most uncomfortable portions of the encounter. The fallen bicycle. The repeated questioning. The visible hesitation after verification had already confirmed lawful ownership. And finally, the moment Colonel Harris addressed the officers calmly, asking a question that required no raised voice to carry weight. What justification remains? The clip spread quickly, because it did not rely on exaggeration. It relied on contrast. Calm composure, facing repeated suspicion. Evidence confirmed, yet doubt continuing. Context arriving too late. Comment sections filled rapidly. Thousands of viewers watched the same sequence of events unfold in real time. A common observation appeared repeatedly. She stayed calm the entire time. Another. They checked the serial number more than once. Another. They still didn't let her go. Visibility created momentum. Momentum created conversation. Conversation created pressure. By 9:15 a.m., the Arlington Police Department's Media Relations Office had already received multiple inquiries requesting clarification regarding the incident. Local journalists requested confirmation. Community organizations requested context. Several viewers asked a direct question. Why had the stop continued after ownership had already been verified? Inside the department headquarters, Lieutenant Sarah Whitaker reviewed the footage carefully. Her expression remained neutral, but the repeated delay between verification and release was unmistakable. Procedure required documentation, but procedure also required proportional response. The video clearly showed the moment dispatch confirmed lawful ownership. It also clearly showed the additional minutes that followed, minutes that now carried weight. Whitaker spoke calmly to the internal review coordinator. Flag this for immediate evaluation, because visibility accelerated accountability. Meanwhile, at Fort Myer, Captain Aaliyah Brooks continued leading the endurance conditioning sequence, as though the morning interruption had never occurred. 32 recruits moved through interval resistance circuits, measured breathing, disciplined pacing, performance data recorded in real time, because preparation environments did not pause for distraction. Sergeant Ellison approached with updated biometric feedback. Recovery intervals improving, he reported. Aaliyah reviewed the tablet briefly. Adjust sprint cycle duration by 12 seconds. Ellison nodded. Because discipline trusted discipline. Across the training field, Recruit Ortiz completed the 5th repetition. Fatigue evident, but form stable. Growth measurable. Progress earned, Colonel Harris observed quietly from the shaded perimeter. His phone vibrated once. A short message from command. The subject line read, "Maplewood incident footage circulating." Harris read the message once, then locked the screen, because visibility rarely surprised him. In environments shaped by structure, accountability was expected. He approached Aaliyah during a brief hydration interval. "The footage is circulating," he said quietly. Aaliyah nodded once. That was likely. "No immediate action required from your side." "Understood." Harris paused briefly. "Command is aware." Because transparency often accelerated resolution. Across the country, thousands of viewers continued sharing the clip. Commentary varied. Some viewers focused on procedural questions. Others focused on broader discussions about perception and assumption. But one theme appeared consistently: composure had shifted the narrative. Because emotional reaction might have allowed the incident to be dismissed as confrontation. Calm discipline forced viewers to examine the process itself. By 10:02 a.m., the Arlington Police Department released a short statement acknowledging awareness of the video and confirming that an internal review had been initiated to evaluate the circumstances surrounding the stop. The wording remained neutral, professional, measured. But the implication was clear: questions had been raised, and those questions required answers. Back on Maplewood Avenue, Margaret Whitfield sat at her kitchen counter replaying the video on her tablet. She had not expected the clip to travel so quickly. She had not expected her own voice, faintly audible in the background, to become part of a broader conversation. I only wanted to be careful. Hearing the words now felt different, because context had expanded beyond the moment itself. Neighbors began messaging privately. Some asked what had happened. Others simply shared the video link. Margaret responded briefly. I believed I was helping. But the statement now felt incomplete, because intention did not erase consequence. Across social media platforms, viewers debated respectfully. Many acknowledged the importance of community vigilance, but many also questioned how quickly suspicion had formed, and why evidence had not resolved the situation sooner. The most widely shared comment read, "Verification should end suspicion, not prolong it." The sentence was simple, but difficult to ignore. At 10:28 a.m., Officer Hale received notification from department leadership requesting a preliminary written account of the interaction timeline. Standard procedure, but expedited, because public visibility altered prioritization. Officer Reeves reviewed the same request moments later. He watched the clip once, then again, noticing details that had felt insignificant in real time. The repeated confirmation from dispatch, the extended questioning, the presence of multiple witnesses recording, moments that now appeared differently when viewed from outside the situation, because perspective often changed once pressure was removed. Back at Fort Myer, Aaliyah concluded the endurance cycle precisely on schedule. 32 recruits completed final recovery drills, measured breathing returning to baseline, performance metrics recorded, improvement visible, consistency maintained. As the group gathered briefly for closing instruction, Aaliyah spoke calmly. External variables do not alter internal standards. Several recruits nodded. Because the statement extended beyond physical conditioning. Colonel Harris observed quietly. Because leadership was most effective when demonstrated rather than explained. As the recruits dispersed, Harris spoke once more. The review process will proceed. Aaliyah nodded once. Procedure applies universally. Harris allowed a small pause, then added, composure often reveals more than argument. Aaliyah adjusted the timing device on her wrist. Consistency reveals everything. Because the events of that morning had demonstrated something clearly, the truth did not always arrive immediately. But when it did, it changed the conversation. And once the conversation changed, accountability often followed. By early afternoon, the video from Maplewood Avenue had reached audiences far beyond Arlington. What began as a short live stream captured by a teenager on a skateboard had now appeared on national commentary pages, discussion forums, and multiple news aggregation feeds. The clip's simplicity made it powerful. There were no dramatic edits, no exaggerated captions, only the unfiltered progression of events, a calm black woman standing beside a fallen bicycle. Officers repeating questions long after verification had already confirmed the truth. People noticed the stillness in her posture. They noticed the tone in her voice. They noticed the moment when the serial number was confirmed. And they noticed how the questioning continued anyway. By 12:40 p.m., the video had been viewed more than 1.8 million times. Comments poured in from veterans, trainers, law students, community leaders, and everyday viewers who recognized something deeper than a misunderstanding. Many pointed out how easily assumptions can become actions. Others observed how quickly perception can shape reality when context is missing. Several former military personnel commented specifically on Aaliyah's composure, noting how recognizable that level of discipline appeared to those familiar with structured training environments. One comment received over 40,000 endorsements. Composure under pressure is not accidental. It is trained. Another read, they didn't just question her ownership. They questioned her belonging. The distinction resonated widely. Because belonging is often judged silently long before questions are spoken aloud. By 1:15 p.m., a regional news outlet published a brief article summarizing the encounter using publicly available footage. The headline avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on procedural questions raised by the timeline of the stop. The article noted that the bicycle's serial number had been confirmed through dispatch verification within minutes. It also noted that the interaction continued significantly longer than necessary. Legal analysts interviewed in the article emphasized that investigative stops must remain proportional to evidence. One former prosecutor commented, "Once ownership is verified, continued detention requires additional justification." The phrasing echoed across social media discussions. Proportional response, reasonable suspicion, procedural boundaries. These terms entered public conversation not as accusations, but as questions. And questions invited examination. At 2:05 p.m., the Arlington Police Department released a second statement confirming that the interaction was under internal review to ensure departmental standards had been followed appropriately. The statement remained professional and neutral. "We are committed to ensuring all interactions reflect fairness, professionalism, and adherence to established procedure." Transparency did not imply wrongdoing, but it acknowledged public concern. And acknowledgement mattered. Meanwhile, at Fort Myer, the afternoon conditioning session continued uninterrupted. Captain Aaliyah Brooks moved efficiently between training stations, observing foot placement, correcting posture, adjusting pacing intervals with precise attention to detail. Her focus remained on performance metrics. Consistency mattered more than distraction. Recruit Ortiz improved his sprint recovery time by 3.2 seconds. Recruit Patel corrected her lifting form after a brief coaching adjustment. Recruit Jensen completed the endurance carry without loss of rhythm. Progress continued, because discipline remained unaffected by external noise. Sergeant Ellison approached with updated data. Group recovery rate improving. Aaliyah reviewed the numbers quickly. Hydration rotation every 9 minutes. Ellison nodded immediately. Structure restored momentum. Across the base, several instructors had already seen the circulating video. None mentioned it during training hours. Professional environments prioritized performance first. Discussion later. Colonel Harris received multiple inquiries from administrative offices requesting confirmation of Aaliyah's role and credentials. His response remained brief. Captain Brooks maintains exemplary performance record and continues full training responsibilities. No elaboration necessary, because credibility had already been established through years of consistent leadership. At 3:30 p.m., a Veterans Association shared the video with commentary emphasizing the importance of composure when facing public misunderstanding. Their statement read, "Respect is often tested long before it is recognized." The message spread widely, because the story resonated across communities with diverse perspectives. Many viewers did not focus solely on the officer's actions. They focused on Aaliyah's response, her stillness, her restraint, her refusal to allow frustration to dictate behavior. One widely shared post summarized the sentiment clearly. Dignity is most visible when challenged. By early evening, the video had surpassed 3 million views. Discussion remained active, measured, reflective. Many viewers acknowledged the importance of public safety vigilance, but they also emphasized the importance of evidence guiding decision-making. Balance, proportionality, fairness. These principles became central to the conversation. Margaret Whitfield watched the coverage from her living room, her earlier confidence replaced by quiet introspection. She replayed the moment she had placed the call, reconsidered the assumptions that had shaped her perception, recognized how quickly incomplete information had led to real-world consequences. Her intention had been caution, but caution without context had produced discomfort she could not ignore. She closed the video slowly, because awareness often arrives quietly, without announcement, without judgment, only understanding. At Fort Myer, Aaliyah concluded the final evaluation rotation at precisely 5 p.m. 32 recruits completed their performance cycles. Metrics recorded. Improvements documented. Consistency maintained. As the recruits gathered briefly for closing remarks, Aaliyah spoke calmly. External pressure does not change internal standards. Several recruits nodded. Because the lesson extended beyond physical conditioning, it applied to leadership, to judgment, to character. Because the events of that morning had demonstrated something simple but powerful. Perception may influence first reactions, but truth shapes final outcomes, and consistency reveals everything in between. By the following morning, the Maplewood Avenue incident had evolved from a local conversation into a structured internal review. The Arlington Police Department did not respond with defensiveness. They responded with process. At 7:10 a.m., the Office of Professional Standards formally initiated an evaluation of the interaction timeline focusing on a single central question. At what point should the stop have concluded? Body camera footage from both officers was retrieved. Dispatch audio logs were reviewed. Timestamps were cross-referenced with the publicly available video that had circulated widely online. The timeline was clear. The serial number verification had occurred within minutes. Confirmation of lawful ownership had been repeated multiple times. Yet the stop had continued. Not aggressively, not violently, but unnecessarily. And unnecessary extension. In professional environments required explanation. Captain Laura Mendez, who supervised procedural compliance reviews, examined the footage carefully. She noted the language used by Officer Reeves, the phrasing suggesting continued doubt despite verification, the repeated references to suspicion without new supporting evidence, the visible hesitation before allowing Captain Brooks to depart. None of these elements individually constituted misconduct, but together they formed a pattern requiring reflection. Process existed for precisely this reason, because professional accountability required continuous calibration. At 9:45 a.m., Officer Reeves and Officer Hale were each asked to submit written statements describing their decision-making process during the stop. Standard procedure: not punishment, not presumption of wrongdoing, but documentation ensured transparency. Hale's statement remained concise. Verification had confirmed ownership. He had communicated this clearly through dispatch. He had recommended conclusion of the stop. Reeves's statement acknowledged reliance on the original caller's concern as justification for extended confirmation. He noted the high value of the bicycle as contributing to perceived irregularity. But perception alone did not satisfy procedural thresholds once verification had been completed. That distinction mattered. At 11:20 a.m., the department scheduled a professional development review session addressing confirmation bias in investigative encounters. Training updates were not unusual. Law enforcement environments continuously adjusted standards in response to emerging data. But the Maplewood incident had accelerated scheduling priority, because public visibility had highlighted the importance of reinforcing existing guidelines. Lieutenant Whitaker summarized the learning objective clearly. Evidence resolves suspicion. When evidence confirms lawful possession, continuation must be justified by new information, not prior assumption. Meanwhile, the department issued a public update acknowledging that the interaction would be used as a case study for reinforcing procedural clarity in future stops. The language remained measured. We remain committed to ensuring all community interactions reflect fairness, proportional response, and evidence-based decision-making. The statement did not attempt to assign blame. It focused on improvement, because improvement strengthened public trust. At Fort Myer, Captain Aaliyah Brooks began the morning conditioning cycle precisely on schedule. The recruits assembled at 0600 hours. Formation alignment exact. Breathing steady. Expectations clear. Structure remained unchanged. Colonel Harris observed briefly before stepping aside to allow the training cycle to proceed without interruption. He later received confirmation that the department had initiated review procedures. His response remained simple. Professional systems improve through examination. Aaliyah did not request updates. She did not seek attention. Her focus remained unchanged. Training performance metrics, consistency benchmarks, operational readiness preparation. Because responsibility did not pause for recognition, Recruit Ortiz improved interval endurance by another measurable margin. Recruit Jensen corrected posture alignment under weighted resistance. Recruit Patel achieved new recovery stability targets. Progress continued, because discipline maintained direction regardless of external attention. By early afternoon, Arlington community representatives announced an upcoming public forum focused on constructive dialogue regarding community trust and professional procedure. The forum invitation emphasized collaboration rather than confrontation, understanding rather than accusation. Because sustainable trust required conversation grounded in mutual respect. Margaret Whitfield read the announcement quietly. She considered attending, not because she expected confrontation, but because reflection often required participation. Her earlier certainty had evolved into something more thoughtful, more aware. She began to understand that vigilance without context could unintentionally create harm. Understanding did not erase the past, but it informed the future. At 3:15 p.m., Officer Hale attended a briefing reviewing confirmation threshold protocols. He listened carefully, not defensively, because continuous improvement defined professionalism across disciplines. Officer Reeves attended the same session, reviewing the footage again privately, noticing the moment where verification had already been confirmed, recognizing how easily initial perception could influence continued interpretation. Experience often refined judgment, but reflection strengthened it further. By evening, the Maplewood incident had shifted from controversy to case study. Law enforcement trainers referenced the timeline when discussing proportional response standards. Legal analysts referenced the case when explaining the importance of evidence-based decision frameworks. Leadership instructors referenced Captain Brooks's composure as an example of maintaining professionalism under scrutiny, because growth often emerged from discomfort, and discomfort often revealed opportunity. At Fort Myer, Aaliyah concluded the final conditioning rotation of the day at precisely 1700 hours. 32 recruits completed their performance benchmarks. Consistency maintained. Improvement measurable. Reliability strengthened. As the recruits gathered for closing instruction, Aaliyah spoke calmly. External judgment does not define internal discipline. The words resonated quietly across the group. Because preparation environments required clarity of identity independent of perception. Colonel Harris observed from the perimeter. Because leadership was most visible through example. And example required consistency. The events of Maplewood Avenue had introduced scrutiny, but scrutiny had produced reflection. Reflection had produced adjustment. Adjustment strengthened systems, because justice did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes justice appeared quietly, through correction, through accountability, through commitment to doing better moving forward. And that commitment defined professionalism. The next morning, Maplewood Avenue looked peaceful again. No flashing lights, no gathering crowd, No phones raised in quiet anticipation, just the soft rhythm of sprinklers ticking across trimmed lawns, and the distant hum of early commuters preparing for another ordinary day. But something had changed, not in the streets, not in the houses, in awareness. Because moments that reveal truth rarely disappear completely. They linger quietly in memory, reshaping perception long after the noise fades. At 5:34 a.m., Captain Aaliyah Brooks rode the same familiar route. Her pace was steady, her posture upright, her breathing controlled. Consistency had always been her foundation. Routine did not pause because of discomfort. Discipline did not adjust because of misunderstanding. As she approached the same stretch of sidewalk where the patrol cars had once blocked her path, she noticed a familiar white SUV parked near the curb. Margaret Whitfield stood beside it. Alone this time. No phone in her hand. No urgency in her posture. Just stillness. Intentional stillness. Aaliyah slowed naturally, placing one foot on the pavement as Margaret stepped forward carefully. "I was hoping I might see you again," Margaret said. Her voice was quieter than before, stripped of the certainty that had once shaped her assumptions. "I wanted the chance to speak without interruption." Aaliyah nodded once. Calm. Attentive. Margaret exhaled slowly before continuing. "I've replayed that morning many times in my mind." She hesitated briefly, searching for the right words. "I told myself I was being responsible. I told myself I was protecting the neighborhood." Another pause. "But I realize now, I never actually questioned why I felt suspicious in the first place." The honesty in her voice carried weight, because self-reflection rarely came easily. "I made a judgment based on incomplete understanding," Margaret continued, "and I allowed that judgment to create a situation that should never have escalated as far as it did." Aaliyah listened without interruption. Because silence often created space for truth, Margaret's hands tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. "I watched the video afterward," she said. "Not just once. Many times." Her voice softened. "You never raised your voice. You never reacted with anger. You remained calm in a situation where many people would not have." She paused again. "That made me realize something uncomfortable." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. Margaret continued. "I assumed confidence meant defiance." Another breath. "But now I understand confidence can also mean discipline." The early morning air felt still, quiet enough that even distant traffic seemed respectful of the moment unfolding. "I regret making that call," Margaret said finally. "I regret allowing assumption to guide my decision." Aaliyah responded calmly. "Awareness often follows experience." Margaret nodded slowly. "I am trying to learn from it. Learning is the beginning of accountability," Aaliyah replied. Margaret gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I spoke with neighbors afterward," she said. "Some agreed with me initially. Others asked questions I couldn't easily answer." Another pause. "I realized how easily we can convince ourselves we are being cautious, when we are actually reacting to unfamiliarity." Aaliyah remained composed. "Unfamiliar does not mean unsafe." Margaret absorbed the words carefully. "I see that now." The quiet sincerity in her voice carried no defensiveness, only reflection. "I wanted to say this directly," Margaret continued, "because responsibility includes acknowledging when we are wrong." Aaliyah inclined her head slightly. "Recognition prevents repetition." Margaret allowed a faint breath of relief, because accountability did not erase the past, but it reshaped the future. As Aaliyah prepared to continue her ride, Margaret added softly, "The way you handled that moment, it changed how I think." Aaliyah's response remained measured. "Composure reveals preparation." Margaret nodded. and preparation reveals character. The statement lingered between them, because understanding had replaced assumption. As Aaliyah resumed pedaling, the steady rhythm of movement returned immediately. Routine restored, structure intact, identity unchanged. Later that morning at Fort Myer, the training grounds moved with familiar precision. 32 recruits rotated through endurance intervals, resistance drills, and recovery pacing exercises. Measured progress, consistent improvement, stable performance indicators, because discipline required repetition. Sergeant Ellison reviewed the latest biometric data. Recovery efficiency improved across all groups. Aaliyah nodded once. Maintain resistance calibration. Across the field, recruit Ortiz completed a timed endurance circuit faster than the previous week. Incremental improvement, sustained effort, earned progress. Colonel Harris observed briefly from the shaded perimeter. He understood something important. Leadership was not defined by the absence of challenge. It was defined by response to challenge. Later in the afternoon, Recruit Patel approached Aaliyah after completing her final repetition. "Ma'am," she said respectfully, "I saw what happened last week." Aaliyah regarded her calmly. Patel continued, "You stayed steady, even when the situation wasn't fair." Aaliyah responded simply, "External pressure does not alter internal standards." Patel nodded thoughtfully. "That takes discipline." "It takes practice," Aaliyah replied. Because composure was rarely accidental. It was built through repetition, refined through challenge, strengthened through consistency. As the training day concluded, the recruits gathered briefly for closing instruction. Aaliyah spoke calmly. "Professional identity is not determined by the opinions of others." The words settled across the group. Preparation ensures stability when circumstances attempt to create doubt. Several recruits nodded. Because the lesson extended beyond training, it applied to leadership, responsibility, character. As the sun lowered beyond the training grounds, the quiet rhythm of preparation continued. Not dramatic, not performative, simply disciplined, because dignity does not require validation. It exists independently of perception. It remains steady even when questioned. It endures even when misunderstood. And when consistently demonstrated, it becomes undeniable. The events on Maplewood Avenue had not changed who Aaliyah was. They had simply revealed her more clearly to those willing to observe. Because true confidence does not announce itself loudly. It remains calm, steady, certain, even when tested, especially when tested.